Welcome everybody. We're getting going a little bit slow on this. Apologize, but we have to get moving quickly. I'm Brian Haus. I have the privilege of moderating this session, and Jennifer Stone is kind of coordinating how all this goes. So if you have any issues, please let Jennifer know during the course of this. And yeah, welcome to the Metabolisms 2. Coastal nature-based infrastructure mapping and modeling. And we have three speakers in this session, and these presentations have been pre-recorded, but the speakers are here with us, and we're going to run them all one after another. And then we will, can you go put the introduction panel up? This script is no longer relevant to what we're actually doing, because there's not going to be a break in between each of the talks. It's going to run one after another, and then we're going to have a good amount of time for questions. So write down your questions or remember them. If you're me, you'd have to write them down. If you're have a little better memory than me, you'll be able to go through. There's three of them. We got about 15 minutes each, and then at the end we'll have about 40 to 45 minutes for questions. So first speaker will be Landolf Rhode-Barbarigos, who's talking about design of coral reefs for nature-based infrastructure and coastal infrastructure. Then we'll have Juan Cervera, who's talking about mangroves and how they've responded to sea level rise in Miami-Dade County. And the final speaker, last but not least, Borja Reguero, who will be discussing nature-based adaptation for resilience and sustainability. So look forward to discussing these three talks with you in about another 40 minutes. So without any further ado, we're gonna get started right on time, 9:25. So anyway, here we go.
Hello, everyone.
There we go.
My name is Landolf Rhode-Barbarigos. I'm an assistant professor at the College of Engineering at the Department of Civil, Architectural, and Environmental Engineering. Today, I will present your work towards the development of design guidelines for coral reefs as protective nature-based coastal infrastructure. This work is based on the thesis of my PhD student, Mohammed Gershon, and is a collaborative effort with Dr. Brian Haus from Ocean Sciences and director of the Sustain Facility, as well as Drs. Andrew Baker, Diego Learman from Marine Biology and Ecology. So let's talk a little bit about corals. So corals are among the most diverse and protective ecosystems on our planet. They are often referred as the rainforest of the sea. Unfortunately, like our forests, our rainforests, they are at a risk of extinction due to pollution, climate change, local stressors. With approximately 360 linear miles of coral reefs, for us here in Florida, they're a vital component for our natural environment. But not only, even our coastal communities depend on them. Coral reefs provide a variety of ecosystem services. These span from habitat, food and tourism, to medical compounds, and of course, shoreline protection that we're going to focus here today. In terms of habitat, you have to know that 25% of all marine species are found in coral reefs. They are thus critical for food and fishing. They are also an important touristic attraction, which contributes further to our local economy. And maybe less known service that they provide is their contribution to the medical sector. There are important compounds that are extracted from corals. Finally, they protect the shoreline from wave action and flooding. U.S. coral reefs protect more than 18,000 people, providing more than 1.8 billion in annual protection services, versus approximately 2 billion for all other services. One can thus say that their most important ecosystem function is actually providing protection to the coastal communities. So let's discuss a little bit how they do that and how we can use them. Coral reefs function as a natural submerged breakwater. They reduce wave action, erosion, and flooding by breaking the waves. Studies have shown that coral reefs can decrease wave height up to 84% and wave energy up to 97%. This protective function is critical for coastal communities, like here in Miami. We are a high-value region, particularly vulnerable to climate change and flooding, due to our hurricane-prone geographic location and our unique low-lying topography. Therefore, it is critical for communities like us not only to conserve, but also explore to the maximum our natural infrastructure. But to do that, we need to quantify how we can use it. We need to quantify its contribution. So the main challenge with this is actually the complex hydrodynamics. To simplify things, I'm showing you here the equation for the wave energy flux, which was provided by Thornton and Guza some time ago. This equation describes how the wave energy is transformed or dissipated through wave breaking and bottom friction. The first term, highlighted in blue, is wave breaking, the instability of the wave. As the water particles move, the wave will actually find an instability and break. There, the energy is dissipated through turbulence. On the other side, the term in green corresponds to the bottom friction. This is basically the resistance, the drag that the water particles sustain as they move. These terms represent the wave energy dissipation mechanisms of a reef. However, please note that they are themselves, let's say, parameters that depend on a multitude of other characteristics. Therefore, in our studies, we use the sustain facility, which allows us to control the different parameters and quantify the impact of corals on those wave dissipation mechanisms. Sustain, or the surge structure atmosphere interaction facility, is a wind wave tank. It's a tank that is unique in the world due to its size, but also to the fact that we can generate directionally varying waves using a 12-paddle system combined with direct wind forces, simulating hurricane conditions up to the category 5 on the Saffir-Simpson scale. Here you can see a video of sustain in action. You can see the mechanically generated waves, and you can see that there is the wind there. So the wind is interacting with the mechanically generated waves in a way that is happening actually in a real storm. So it amplifies their effect. In our work, we want to assess the wave reducing capacity of a coral reef with staghorn corals. This is Acropora cervicordis. And we want to quantify the impact of the corals on the wave energy dissipation mechanisms that we saw before. Therefore, we used the rigid model of an artificial coral reef, and we tested it with and without coral skeletons on top of it. Here you have an illustration of our experimental setup with the coral model in the middle and the points of measurements that we were taking. Our hypothesis is that if no wave breaking is induced by the coral skeletons, then their contribution will be solely to friction. So we compare two model configurations, one without the coral skeletons and one with the coral skeletons on it. And we evaluated wave transmission and wave energy reduction. These are performance criteria that are calculated based on water level measurements before and after the model. Here we have a photo of the model, the bare reef and the reef with the skeletons, and as well as the analysis that we're trying to do. So let me talk a little bit about our results and the analysis that we did. So first, here I'm showing you wave transmission. Wave transmission is defined as the ratio between the wave height after the reef over the wave height before the reef. In other words, it is the percentage of wave height that went through the reef. As we can see here, you have the breakwater and the breakwater with the corals. And here you can see that the breakwater with the coral skeletons on it showed less transmission. In other words, more wave reduction compared with the breakwater configuration. And it's important to understand again that these rates vary with the configuration of the model, but also the water level that we have in the tank, and wave parameters such as the height and the length described here by the wave stiffness. So this is important because these results vary based on the multitude of parameters that we have to take into account. Here we see a parameter that relates to the wave energy. So we have the wave energy for the same conditions that we discussed before. Again, we highlight the contribution from the corals in green, and it is clear that the breakwater with the coral skeletons on it dissipates more energy. Again, considering our hypothesis that there is no wave breaking, we estimated the impact of the coral skeletons alone on wave energy. So these percentages that you see there, from 5% all the way to 56%, represent the contribution of the coral skeletons. We can thus provide guidance on the effect of the corals on an engineered reef structure. However, again, it is clear that this effect will vary according to the conditions and the structure itself, the morphology of that structure. Now, I want to say that we went a step further. We also calculated the related coral friction coefficient for each test that we did. And this is important because in the large hydrodynamic models that are being used to quantify the effects of coral reefs, their effect is typically modeled by a friction coefficient, an enhanced friction coefficient. So us calculating that provides validation, but also guidance to the friction coefficient that has to be used in those parameters. Now, using our results, we are currently moving towards a pilot deployment. The deployment will take place offshore of North Beach, Oceanside Park, in collaboration with the city of Miami Beach. And this is in the context of a University of Miami Laboratory for Integrative Knowledge, a ULINK project, which investigates coral reef for shoreline protection. We are working on the installation of 3 reef structures that will be populated with corals from our nurseries and monitored to quantify their impact on wave action. Here you have an illustration of the 3 variants of the structure, as well as some geo coordinates and the measurement points that we are considering. Again, we're measuring before and after the reef. The structures that we are going to implement include 2 variants of a monolithic trapezoidal concrete structure, and one will have a flat surface, while the other one will have a boulder reef profile. The third variant is what we call sea hive system. It's basically an engineered shoreline protection system composed of concrete perforated hexagonal prisms. This is research currently, this is a system currently under research and development here at UM. All 3 structures have been analyzed in terms of the forces, have been analyzed in terms of their stability, and are currently under permitting review. Similar to our laboratory tests, we will have wave and current measurements to assess the performance of these structures in terms of wave dissipation. The structure will be, again, populated by corals. We will also monitor the growth of the corals and correlate that to their wave dissipation. These results, combined with theoretical and numerical models, provide a unique opportunity for merging nature-based features and human-made structures for shoreline protection, and further to that, for guiding their implementation. Our work represents thus a key step towards the development of design guidelines for coral reefs as protective, nature-based coastal infrastructure. Thank you for your attention, and here I would like to acknowledge some agencies, some important stakeholders, as well as some of our colleagues who participate in this project. Thank you very much.
All right. Hey, everyone. My name is Juan Cervera, and I'm a master's student with the Marine Ecosystems and Societies Department at the Roses DO School. Today, I'll be speaking concerning my project of modeling mangrove forest shift due to relative sea level rise rates in Miami-Dade, and how I plan to disseminate the results to affect change in resource management. So what does that mean? So in other words, due to rising sea level, mangrove extent has been dying back from global shores, despite their ability to increase their elevation through sediment accretion. The question is whether A, are there areas where sediment accretion could potentially outpace relative sea level rise in the county? And B, if not, what avenues will mangrove forests have to establish into their neighboring salt marshes? Okay, so a little bit about the setting. The study area of Miami-Dade County, I chose this county not just because I live here, but it's well defined by the very dense urban infrastructure, as well as that large tract of wilderness from the Everglades. The Everglades is a mix of palustrine and estuarine habitats that has shown to allow for documented mangrove recession into salt marsh habitats. Then there's the city of Miami-Dade County, where mangrove appear in several conservation sites, dedicated green spaces, or coasts and canals. So mangrove play a large role in both halves of the county, both terrestrial and or urban and the wilderness. But the question is how that role will shift when under pressure. So what are these pressures I'm exploring? For the marine side, the obvious answer is sea level rise. While mangroves can tolerate inundation, excessive persistent flooding will drown them out. Then there's densely populated infrastructure, which allows little room for proper colonization. This creates an effect named coastal squeeze, where the pressures of sea level rise and impermeable urban development thin out coastal habitats from both sides. Rather, natural hydrology and permeable green spaces would allow for mangrove forests to recede inland or preferably accrete enough sediment to outpace rising sea level. So the problem facing management is where exactly mangroves will shift from sea level rise. Where are they most resilient? Where are they most vulnerable? Where do salt marsh lose most of their extent? Where does coastal squeeze put the most pressure? Now, there does exist prediction models through NOAA of how sea level rise will look throughout the county that has been applied to marsh recession. But these predictions lack actual dieback consideration, what mangroves can tolerate in terms of inundation, recorded rates of sediment accretion. They don't use a separation between estuarine woody wetland vegetation from herbaceous ones, right? So that mangrove versus salt marsh, spartina marsh, or I guess Sporobolus now, marsh habitat extent, or how inland hydrology plays a role in colonization paths, where mangrove propagules require a means to float further inland in order to establish, rather than wind or animal seed transport, which thankfully, or else this would all be much harder to model. So with hydrological modeling and documented habitat extents, a better idea of marsh to mangrove shift can be determined, not just for the Everglades wetlands, but also the forests that dot the city of Miami-Dade's coasts and canals. All right, so to meet the goals of this project, I divided into three major objectives within the study area of Miami-Dade County. The first objective would be to model that dieback of fringed mangrove forests, and a sub-objective to that would be to model the subsequent colonization into neighboring salt marshes. The second objective would be to determine a section of inland mangrove extent and apply the model parameters to estimate squeezing effects further inland, like within the canals. And a third objective would be to distribute the model results through a web mapper to allow that ease of access for the local resource managers. I'll be going through each objective and speak to how that may be accomplished and build towards the subsequent objective, and then a couple of limitations per objective. So starting off, there's objective 1, modeling that mangrove dieback. There's a few key concepts being explored in this case. One would be the mangrove tolerance to inundation or flooding, the sediment accretion, and sea level rise. Several factors may play into mangrove tolerance for flooding, but the main elevation-based variable is when the aerial roots are sufficiently inundated to the point of suffocation. Once the lenticels of the root are completely covered, an individual tree can no longer exchange nutrient or remove waste. But mangrove forests naturally protect against this. The mesh-like network of aerial roots can trap sediment traveling by above ground water runoff. This secretes the sediment under the tree and builds the ground up, but not out, allowing for historical instances of forests outpacing previous sea level rise events. Results should show that, can a mangrove outpace current sea level rise models? And if so, where would we expect that submergence or resilience? And then the sub-objective is beyond just moving up, mangroves can move back and away from encroaching waters into neighboring salt marshes. Salt marsh habitats can't tolerate that same level of tidal influx that mangrove forests can. And as these tidal waters reach further in, newly flooded canals allow floating propagules to establish inland. To determine these potential canals, a hydrological model based on a multi-directional flow approach using the elevation gradients of the area is applied throughout the Everglades. So the flow accumulation can be delineated into these smaller watersheds that show where the potential for seed establishment could present itself. With that said, the hope for this project is expected to determine resilient areas along the coastal range of mangroves. The results, while highlighting these areas quick to flood, also shows those that allow for long-lasting propagule establishment and vegetation succession, which are a few early indicators of a naturally regenerating mangrove forest. The hope would be, through these variables, to pinpoint resilient areas to focus on conservation or restoration efforts. But there are going to be variables that cannot be accounted for. The first and most apparent one should be that mangrove forests are not just these one cohesive species that all act the same. Florida has 3 different species of mangroves, each are very different trees, very different roots and seeds. Currently, any data on forest extent homogenizes these tree stands into one blob of mangrove forest. Sediment accretion results will have to be interpolated for the whole, with future considerations to possibly utilize imagery classification to distinguish between the species by their canopy shapes and color, but that's not within the scope of this project currently. It should be repeated as well that sediment accretion will have to be interpolated. A surface elevation table can only get a snapshot on where exactly it was implemented. And with just a few tables throughout the Everglades, that means larger unknowns between them. But this still improves on simply using historical or potential rates of accretion. The hydrology of the Everglades has changed so significantly that historical rates just don't account for that anymore. And with any spatial analysis, of course, resolution will play a large role in accuracy. With lower resolutions, hydrology becomes less defined, but with such a large study area, higher resolution data is either segmented into pieces, which ruins the flow determination, or is simply incomplete. There's always going to be compromise in accuracy, feasibility, and the deliverability of the product. Right, so objective 2, so this objective comes out of necessity, given a lack of data for the true extent of mangroves in Miami-Dade County. Currently, some of the best analyzable spatial data for mangrove extent in Florida is concentrated to the coastal habitats. The image shown here shows relatively low resolution possibility for woody wetlands, but not necessarily known mangrove extent. This leaves a large part of the urban mangrove population unaccounted for in the model results, underestimating the extent of coastal squeeze throughout the city. So first part of this objective will be to map out a mangrove forest within an inland canal of Miami-Dade. Then we could use supervised image classification algorithm from aerial imagery of the area with some ground truthing to determine accuracy. So the results will have to be analyzed by the model parameters, but they're going to change a bit from the first objective. So with sediment accretion, much of the sediment accretion on the coast of the Everglades is expected to have diminished due to diverted hydrology from agriculture and development. And a lot of that diverted hydrology flows down through the man-made canals in Miami, giving these mangroves more sediment to build from. There are no surface elevation tables to pull from here. So sediment accretion interpolations from the Everglades are largely an assumption. But determination of colonization and potential resilience can still be found through elevation gradients. So with that said, despite the limitations, objective results here have a larger impact on management decisions where human impact and cost are concentrated within the city. With county officials and resource managers looking at greener methods of resilience, their decision should be as best informed as possible before large investments are placed on projects that may be bound to fail due to inundation. So with the last objective, it involves consolidating the results of those other 2 objectives and distributing them to reach as wide an audience of those resource managers and county officials as possible. This will be done by designing a WebMapper application using Esri's API to display and query the model results in combination with JavaScript to handle the logic for tool functionality. The concept for the framework is not too dissimilar, but tool functionality and design will take shape as stakeholder feedback is brought into consideration, right? So the development cycle for this mapper is outlined to allow stakeholder input to design the resulting application functionality to best meet their needs. I did not want to create this application in a vacuum and create a barrier for entry or use. So starting off, stakeholders or users, that I'll refer to them from here on, translates to the resource managers through Miami-Dade County that have mangrove habitats under their purview, right? So this could mean National Park Service, State Park Service, county resource managers, or as small as city municipalities, right? That's going big to small. With representatives chosen, development begins with initial design meetings between users and developers, brainstorming those functionalities that they may see being useful, but are not included in the starting framework. Once starting concepts are agreed upon, the development cycle starts with designing, implementing, and testing tools through the developer side, which would be me. And then inevitably meetings between users and developers resumes at regular intervals to allow that private testing, feedback, and new concepts from the user side of things. The final application is subject to change and added functionality, but at minimum should display predictive mangrove extent from the other objectives, offer area metrics and spatial information, and be readily available for public use. While this objective is not the main output, it's imperative to the project's applicability. It's not to say that the model output wouldn't be useful without it, but managers do not always have that ease of access to project data. This just adds that extra step to the data management, which brings in stakeholder consideration and awareness, improving that flow of information. So with that project explained, why is it needed? I'm showing off these pictures of mangroves as if they're charismatic species, right? But that's not really the case. But they are an important species, one that provides coastal erosion protection and nursery habitation for fishery species that has a big draw on the economy. The county of Miami-Dade has spent millions on restoration efforts on disturbed areas, but some of those forests, after nearly 25 years of regeneration, have yet to compare to their natural counterparts, both structurally and ecologically. To show an example, here's a few historical shots of Billbag State Park's mangrove restoration site, which was started back in '96. They finished planting red mangrove in '98 and allowed for natural recruitment of black and white mangrove. And despite the forest finally gaining a full canopy sometime after 2014, structurally, the forest is still fairly underdeveloped. Recently, having gone to analyze the development and comparing it to admittingly a very developed forest in Florida, the restoration site is comparatively young. And with no avenue to recede, this forest space is all it has. So I can't say at this point how resilient the spot is, but knowing that ahead of time just adds that much more certainty to the restoration process. I will say that currently, though, the full forest gradient from fringe to basin does seem healthy and in the proper range of vegetation succession. But every subsequent 25 years, the tidal gradient will change and the feasibility of these restorations change. You can see here work done by Krause and colleagues, how mangrove extent through the 10,000 Islands region of the Western Everglades shifted from 1927 to 1940 to 2005. As the pressures driving these changes increase, we can only expect higher rates of colonization. So a well-informed model is needed to determine the resiliency of future mangroves, rather than working off of just those historical sites or habitations. What works now for mangroves is not necessarily what's going to work 50 years down the line, which is what resource managers need to start considering right now. And that is my project. I would like to say, one, of course, thank you everyone for tuning into this presentation. I'd also like to acknowledge the NOAA EPP and LMR CSC, Dr. DA, Dr. Araujo, Dr. Mack, Dr. Leo, and the Rosenstiel School for facilitating this project. Okay, thank you very much.
Hello, thank you for the invitation to participate today. My name is Borja Reguero. I'm an associate researcher at UC Santa Cruz. I'm here to talk about nature-based adaptation as an opportunity to align resilience and sustainable blue agendas. As we see many coastlines across the globe, we are seeing an increase in the cost of coastal impacts such as flooding and erosion. Our traditional response has relied on hard engineering and coastal structures, but they are not always effective and often have environmental effects. So in this context, there is a new generation of possible solutions, and that involves restoring and using the natural processes of coastal ecosystems in a smart engineering way. So we can not only provide coastal protection benefits, but also leverage the other services that ecosystems provide. Yet, one of the main issues is that we are not maintaining this natural infrastructure adequately, and we are quickly losing those services, including the coastal protection they provide. Here I saw an example for coral reefs off the coast of Southeast Florida, where the US Geological Survey measured elevation change of over 1 meter in depth over the recent decades. Why this is important is because coral reefs' wave attenuation potential depends on two main factors. The first is water depth, and the second is roughness. So in this graphic, what we see is as we decrease the hydrodynamic roughness, which is a function of how healthy and how complex the reef system is, we are increasing wave-driven runoff. The same happens if we increase the sea level or we decrease, or if we increase the sea level or we increase the depth of the reef. So as we are degrading coral reefs, they are getting deeper and they are getting smoother, and this is creating more wave-driven runoff and therefore flooding. But we cannot protect what we don't value. A few years ago, we developed this framework with the World Bank to value the coastal protection benefits of ecosystems. It involves a sequence of steps, and it starts by defining the offshore dynamics. This means extreme sea levels and wave climate conditions. We downscale and we propagate those waves to the near shore. Then we take into account the effect of the habitats in coastal processes, and we define the impacts of flooding and erosion. Then we are able to calculate how many people and dollars fall in the flood hazard zone. So we have a direct metric of the consequences of that coastal hazard impact. This infographic is just showing you the comparison of two scenarios where you have a healthy mangrove forest attenuating waves and storm surge versus another scenario where the mangrove forest has been degraded and is not able to provide that flood protection anymore. So just by comparing to these two main scenarios, you are able to quantify the risk reduction benefit of that ecosystem. We have applied this framework in a number of regions and for different ecosystems, but today I wanted to show, I wanted to share the example for US coral reefs, and that demonstrates that they serve as a natural flood barrier. So the situation is that in many coastlines, we're going from a situation of healthy coral reefs that are able to provide wave attenuation and flood reduction into something that is has a smoother surface and also is deeper. So we adapted this framework, and essentially involves three main phases. So the first is defining the hazards by downscaling over 60 years of wave data to the near shore, so just in front of the reefs. Then we use state-of-the-art and non-linear hydrodynamic models to model the effect of reefs on waves and flooding. And we are able to quantify how much flooding we have for two main scenarios. One of them is with the existing reefs as they are today. And then the graded reef scenario, where we assume that we have lost that friction that they provide, and also they are 1 meter deeper. And the third step is to actually quantify the socioeconomic consequences. For this, we reconstruct and we define spatially what is the flood zone for different storm probabilities with the reefs and with the degraded reefs. And we are able to quantify how many people, how many buildings, and how many economic damages are between those flood hazard zones. So here I show you an example for Miami. In blue, you can see the 100-year flood zone with existing reefs. And in red, you see how much flooding increases when we lose coral reefs. Then we are able to quantify how many people, how many assets and buildings are in those areas. And at the building block level, so the flood mapping, it's available at 10 by 10 meters flood hazard maps, and we're able to quantify how, and pinpoint in individual communities and individual buildings in the new flooded area. We are also able to integrate this, especially by counties, by states, and also nationally. So here I show you the national results where we can see the people, the direct damages, and also the indirect economic impact across 4 different return intervals, which is a measure of the probability of storm conditions. The blue line represents the system risk. So for different storm probabilities, how many people, direct damage and indirect economic impact you could expect. And the situation with a degraded reef is that it increases risk substantially. And the area in between the 2 lines, the blue and the red line, represents the benefit that we are getting from coral reefs. The other thing we can do is we can integrate across storm probabilities to calculate what we call annual expected damage and annual expected benefits. So this is an annual metric of how much protection coral reefs are providing. Doing so, we are able to calculate that per year, coral reefs protect over 18,000 people and over $1.8 billion annually from flood impacts. We are able to map these benefits, especially at very fine resolution. So on the left side, I show the economic benefits per year in Florida. On the right side, you see the people protected per year in Florida. The first things that you may have noticed is that the 2 metrics don't exactly correlate to each other. So you can actually find communities or sections of reefs that are protecting a high number of people, while other sections of reefs may be protecting a high valuable property. This is another example of how these benefits are highly concentrated in a specific areas of the country. So this is an example for Oahu, that's in Hawaii, that shows how specific stretches of coral reefs are providing most of the flood risk reduction benefits in the entire island. So once we are able to identify specific sections of coastlines that are protected by this natural infrastructure, the next obvious question is how we can actually conserve, maintain, and restore these natural flood barriers. So coral reef restoration is challenging because it needs to involve and it needs to meet 3 main objectives. So first, it needs to provide coastal protection. It needs to also be a functional ecosystem. And third, it needs to provide community benefits. It essentially involves 3 scales that are interrelated. So the first one is the coral scale, where you actually need to look to maximize outplanting success. The second scale is the restoration scale, where you are looking to maximize wave energy attenuation. And the third scale involves predicting the coastal, the shoreline response, and also the hazard risk reduction benefit for the community. Identifying the hazard risk mitigation benefits of ecosystems open important opportunities to align both the climate and environmental agendas. This is because ecosystems provide other important environmental benefits. So in our case, US coral reefs have been estimated to provide over $2 billion annually in other associated ecosystem services that include biodiversity, fisheries, and tourism. So the hazard risk mitigation benefits of 1.8 billion annually, first, it tells us that is of substantial magnitude compared to other ecosystems, but also opens new opportunities to how we can use pre-disaster mitigation funding and also post-disaster funding to invest in projects that both meet risk mitigation goals and also provide environmental benefits. Essentially, how we decide to invest in those projects is a function of the hazard risk reduction cost, the hazard risk reduction potential, and also the cost of those projects. So here I want to share some example of opportunities that also involve the private sector. So the first is the Coastal Zone Management Trust that was developed by the Nature Conservancy for Quintana Roo, Mexico. The trust has two main objectives. The first is to fund to invest in long-term restoration and maintenance of the reef and the beach system, because the two ecosystems are working together to provide coastal protection to highly valuable touristic areas. The second goal is to get a parametric insurance policy that covers those restoration costs in a situation of a catastrophic storm. A catastrophic storm that actually occurred last year in October 2020, the coral reef insurance policy was triggered by Hurricane Delta. So the trust received over $800,000 just by getting the insurance policy on the natural infrastructure. So the Nature Conservancy has recently released a report identifying the feasibility of similar insurance policy covers for Florida and Hawaii using the results that we have seen. The second example that I wanted to share is a new mechanism that we developed last year. It's called the Resilience Insurance, and it's a way to align nature-based risk reduction with risk transfer options. So essentially, it takes different steps, but it assumes you do an upfront investment in a risk reduction project. It could be a coastal protection work. In our case, it would be a coral reef restoration project that is able to reduce flood risk. So if it's reducing flood risk, then you are qualified to get a reduction in your premium in a typical insurance policy. So those reduced premiums accumulated over time, over a period of years, they can represent a saving in your original investment in reducing your risk. So we have run these simulations for different ranges of parameters and scenarios for typical reef restoration projects. And we estimate that about 40% of the investment in coral reef restoration could be saved over a 5-year period, just by combining the investment in resilience with investment with an insurance policy. Similar tools and techniques can be applied to other ecosystems too, including oyster reefs, dune marshes, or mangroves. Some of the pros is that we have more experience with restoration of other ecosystems. Permitting may be easier too. And some of the simpler coastal configurations also are less challenging from a modeling point of view. The downsides are that some of these settings and landscapes are more complex from a geomorphic point of view. And also the different spatial scales of the coastal processes involved may also present some challenges. But nowadays we have the tools to represent this the effect of ecosystems in coastal processes at very fine scales. And here on the right side, I just show you a panel indicating the really fine resolution that we're able to simulate coral reefs and how they interact with beach and dunes and vegetation. And this is one example for Miami Beach. So as a summary, I would like to conclude indicating the mounting evidences that we have that demonstrate how ecosystems serve as a natural infrastructure, that we can quantify the risk reduction value of natural and nature-based features, that we can assess rigorously and spatially, This represents opportunities for both ecosystems, for how we manage ecosystems and how we manage our coastline. So first, we can prevent future risk by just valuing and conserving this natural infrastructure. Second, we can implement effective adaptation that uses these natural processes in our benefit. And third, we can provide multiple benefits and leverage the other services so we can contribute we can build coastal resilience, but also contribute to the coastal economy. So with that, I just wanted to thank you to attend this talk and conference. And I leave there my email in case you have more specific questions. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Borja, and thank you, Juan and Landolf. And the question session is they're here to answer your questions directly. So now you get to interact a bit. And so please, you can post questions in the chat, and we can read them. And I guess, if I'll read the question out, or it's probably the way that this will work. And then you can see if it's not, you can put more follow-up in there if you would like. That way we eliminate the switching back and forth. But so the first question, which I presume you may want to put if there's anybody you specifically want to address your question to, but I think that this one probably either for Borja, but if others feel they want to chime in, then we can, Borja, you could answer the question verbally as opposed to in the chat. That would be fine.
Yeah, okay, thank you, Brian. Yeah, I was going to type in.
The question, I'll just read it in case somebody isn't looking at the chat box. Says, can you please, this is from Donette Francis, can you please explain the process of sediment accretion and what is the relationship between the coral reef ecosystem and the mangroves?
Yeah. So I will also let others to chip in, but I mean, essentially, and I think this question is important also for restoration projects, right? And restoration goals, because essentially what we see in many coastlines is like we start planting mangroves, mangrove gardening, many places. Like you see a lot in Southeast Asia, for example, and then we are losing those mangroves, they restore areas too, because we are just losing the offshore barriers. So it's important to reduce that wave action just to maintain and make the restoration successful. So this is why in some areas, for example, we are implementing permeable dams just to reduce this wave impact on the restoration areas. So there is a balance between the energy in the system, right? So you actually need to have healthy reefs in front of mangroves just to maintain a lower wave energy environment. So the restoration and the mangroves can first, the shoreline doesn't erode, and also the restoration can be successful. Yeah, so there is definitely a direct link between the different ecosystems and the multiple barriers of defense, and this obviously gets translated in wave energy and in sediment transport potential.
Can I jump in?
Certainly.
All right. So I think coming back to the question about the sediment accretion, I think we know that because of the hydrodynamics and the structures that you have there, I mean, I'm talking about the physical coral reefs there, we know that the impact, how much the sediments will be basically transferred. So you can use them in the right way to protect erosion from the shore. And we also know that there are issues with respect to the sediments because the corals do not like sediments to go on top of them. And of course, the mangroves are also affected. So while you play with one side of, let's say, the parameters, the important thing there is to understand that this has an impact also on the other side, as Borja was mentioning. So it's all about the balance between what I would call whatever engineered or green engineered solution we're trying to implement and what would be the impact on the natural side, the restoration side. So you have to balance those two to get the performance, but also the sustainable, let's say, growth that we're looking for here. So I think that's very important to understand. Now, with respect to how it happens, well, it depends on the site, on the hydrodynamics, on the morphology of the structure and the reef that you're putting there. So there's a lot more that should be said there. One thing that I can tell you regarding the structures I showed there, these are small structures, so the impact, so parameters that are important is where you are from the shore and how lengthy or how big is your structure in other ways. So.
Thank you, Landolf. I don't know if the second question is kind of related to the first. If you have any follow-up on that for the question.
Oh, sorry, I just saw the second question.
She wrote, in the restoration of coral, have you taken into consideration the sand that moves up from the beaches that are constantly filled with sand? I guess that means the renourishment maybe that ends up on the sea.
Well, in our project, so if you want to have an impact, let's say on beach renourishment, you have to have like a large infrastructure. In the structures that we're putting on there, we're going to monitor what happens locally. So that's why you can see it as a micro experiment where we see how sediments are affected in front and behind the structures. But we don't expect that we're going to have sedimentation on our structures that will impact the corals that we will transplant. But of course, if someone has to do a large project, you also have to think about how this transfer of sediment will occur. And if you have beach renourishment projects, then you have to think about how this also will affect later on your project. So that's important also. What we hope is that we can show that we do have an impact and a positive impact because of our work also with Borja there, modeling where the reefs should be. And based on that, we can maybe work in parallel with the other efforts to reduce beach renourishment because we reduce erosion. So that's the important thing there.
Yeah, just to add a little bit there. Yeah, as the sand is like in South Florida, for instance, our sand supply is very limited for doing beach renourishments going forward. And that's becoming more of an issue. So the ability to hopefully reduce the need to do these in the future as often and use as much would be a definite benefit to the coastal communities. And furthermore, I think that one of the things about beach renourishment that is a good model for this type of work of these nature-based systems is one of the criticisms has been, well, these things can fail in a storm, like your corals are going to get destroyed and maybe your mangroves, some of them seagrass is torn up. But if we start to think, as Borja alluded to, some of thof these financing mechanisms wherein you recognize that, yes, you may lose these things over at some point in the project, but that's part of the cost built in is that reduces the impact on the coastal community. And then you may have to, redo this. But this is already built into the sort of the concept of beach renourishment. We don't expect them to be permanent. I don't know, does anybody else have any comments on that question? Or the beach? Okay, so any other questions from the audience?
I see there's a question from Katie on the chat, Brian. I don't know.
Okay. Okay, let me look at the chat. What is I guess is it about the timing of the reef pilot in North Beach?
Well, the first question is for Juan there about maps where we lost.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I can go ahead with that.
Yeah, so, Juan, why don't you take that one?
Sure. So I can't say for certainty. I haven't seen any maps with like a good resolution of what we can expect to lose from mangroves in the next 10 to 20 years, in the short term. And I feel like that might be, what I'm doing with my project is going yearly, but so far what I'm seeing from preliminary results, it's going to take a little bit longer in 10 to 20 years to see a significant loss. There might be a little bit of change in the actual, shape of the coast, but again, it'll be like in a few tens of meters, maybe even less for the mangroves themselves, because again, sediment accretion right now is doing an okay job of outpacing, but where we get worried about is when we start seeing, the even like the lowest possibilities of sea level rise trends, that sediment accretion will not be able to outpace in the future. So right now, the next 20 years, doesn't look terrible, but once you start getting away from that and the trend starts getting worse and worse, then that's when we start seeing significant loss.
Thank you, I guess, and then thank you, Juan. And Katie had another question for Landolf there, was what about the timing of the pilot project you discussed?
So we're in the process of permitting. So I think we aim for the next 3 to 6 months to have the permit if possible, and then work on the deployment. If we can do it before hurricane season, that would be great. So, but I mean, we're actively there. We have the Army Corps permit, and we're now working with Durham on the second part of the permit.
Okay, yeah. So hopefully that'll be coming forward soon, and should be a lot of interesting work come out of that. There's another question there from Carla about in the chat is that what do you think are some of the challenges on the institutional uptake of the resilience policies you mentioned? Anybody would want to take a stab at that one?
Yeah, I can start. So I think it's referring to the examples I saw. So in the case of Mexico, I mean, this qualified. So first, it's public and private sector, right? Because it's participated by the government, but there's a lot of involvement from the private sector, from the hotel association, who actually participates in the fund, and then the fund gets the insurance policy. So you actually need a lot of exposure, a lot of coastal exposure, you know, to justify one of those private driven solutions. As in the report that I mentioned in one of my slides, the TNC has already looked into this, and just by the high concentration of socioeconomic benefits of coral reefs in the US, there will be sections of shorelines that could qualify for similar mechanisms. However, for me, one of the institutional challenges, and it's more than institutional, is that we have not measured and quantify how much protection we are just losing by not maintaining these ecosystems properly. So we usually, we keep referring to sea level rise and increasing impacts of storms, but actually we are also losing these natural barriers. So it should start by trying to figure out ways to better conserve and invest in the maintenance of these barriers, just to reduce the cost of the needed adaptation. Because otherwise we will have to just increase future investments in just protecting what we are losing. So that will be the first step. And I think there are, in the US and other countries, there are really good initiatives just trying to incentivize both the proactive investment in nature-based adaptation, but also in maintaining the system protection that these ecosystems offer. And it's probably also from the scientific point of view, we have only recently started to value these socioeconomic benefits and the status and health of these ecosystems as they relate to coastal protection. So I think this information can be really helpful to identify better ways to manage them.
Thanks. So you get an opportunity to see the kind of work Juan is doing. Is that the sort of thing that can be implemented in these long-term models? You have this idea of what the future growth or setbacks or decay of mangroves and shorelines. That seems to be the kind of work that might inform your long-term modeling. Is that true? There's another question in the chat from Carla, and this one's for the panel. It says the establishment of nature-based solutions is quite technical and requires much interdisciplinary collaboration. Can you comment on how other stakeholders, e.g. coastal residents, can contribute to this collaboration?
I'd like to speak a little bit to it, and the other panelists can jump in as well. But so I think that the burden of putting yourself out there and putting your abilities out there as other collaborators shouldn't be on you to figure it out. It might be more on us as the project developers, as the ones who are seeking out this information and the ones who are trying to put together this information, to try and include those collaborators in. So I think, you know, coastal residents, I mean, keep a lookout for when us as researchers or resource managers are seeking your aid or your assistance in how you can contribute, right? And we'll usually come up with different ways. In my case, I'm looking for those resource managers and asking them to put their input into how they want to be informed on what my model products are going to be and how they want that information presented to them in the easiest way possible.
Yeah, and to resonate that, I think the important thing is to educate yourself, to ask for information, and if you can integrate and promote those, I would say, solutions, and ask the questions, what can we do about it? And then based on that, you can support the cause in different ways, from your own, let's say, development to basically minor things that make a difference from, let's say, sustainability component there. So there are multiple levels that we can all work together on this. But I think the most important thing is to look and know and be aware. So I applaud everybody here, because that's exactly what we're doing right now. We're discussing this, we're getting informed, and by taking the word out, we can make a change there.
Yeah, and I will add that something that we have seen in the recent years, and also driven by the US Corps of Engineers and other groups, is like we are increasing this know-how of nature-based solutions projects, pilots, but also more established techniques. And then what we can see is in many of these projects, they're like the community component is really important, right? So I know like of examples that were actually driven by the community. So they essentially are saying like, wait a minute, so we recognize the role of ecosystems and natural processes in the impacts that we are observing. So the first thing is like, let's manage them differently, and also let's think about alternative solutions that actually use those natural processes. And it turned out that the final solution is more beneficial in terms of it's not only providing effective coastal protection, it's also providing many other services. I mean, and as I said, the know-how and the experience base is increasingly potentially. And the community and stakeholder involvement and local involvement is critical in many of these examples that we see.
Anybody? Okay, I don't know anything there. Otherwise, there's a comment from Lynette, I think, Cardock, that was, I think, related to the discussion about the impermanence of some of these things, and how that is actually, if we think about it in that way, that they serve a function and then may have to be refurbished. And so these systems may be impacted with large storms, but at the end, they may have served a function of protecting infrastructure behind them. And then there's a question also from Lauren Riley in the chat, who says, is it realistic to replace Miami's seawalls with mangroves? Anybody?
So I'll take the hit on that, and I will say no. But what is realistic is to replace it with seawalls with mangroves. So that's, I think, the idea for us here. Like, basically, you need to work with the site, and you need to work with the identity of your space. So nature-based solutions require time and require space. Sometimes we don't have that, in the sense that you might not have the footprint availability, you might not have basically the time to allow the propagules to develop and protect, so the complexity that you need to get the protection level that you desire. However, we know that on the other hand, the seawall alone will not be neither eco-friendly or sustainable or the right way to go in terms of performance sometimes. So I think the best idea there is to combine those, to get this ecosystem services, to get that sustainability component, and provide, let's say, seawalls with mangroves, if we can say that right now. So I think that would be my answer there.
Yeah, and I think this connects with the first question that we got. I mean, it's essentially it's a function of the geophysics and also the landscape that you have. So if you have reefs protecting the beach profile and the dunes and the vegetation on those dunes, then if you are trying to install mangroves there where they did not exist, like, like the likelihood of success is really low, right? If you actually are putting seawalls in an area of a degraded mangrove, and then you are able to identify a hybrid solution that is providing that flood protection for the higher sea levels, and then still having the mangrove restored in front of the rigid structure, so it actually provides less storm surge. There are like examples that show that you can actually save cost in the design of that structure just by the attenuation, the surge attenuation, and the wave action reduction that you are that the vegetation is providing. So you can actually optimize these designs. But if you are trying to install something that was not originally there, and the geophysics and the ecological conditions are not adequate, I mean, it will be not an effective solution.
Juan, do you have anything to add to this discussion regarding the?
No, I mean, I would just echo what everyone else has said, Landolf and Borja. I mean, they know, and I know Landolf has been working on this recently, that you can't just place a fully grown, developed mangrove forest right in the spot that you need it, right? You need something man-made that is sort of helping that sort of ecosystem service that you should be expecting from a well-developed mangrove, and help that mangrove build itself up to that expectation of, okay, now this can provide some resiliency. Because it needs to be understood that these forests are facing just as much pressure as the infrastructure behind them. So yeah, echoing that, we do need that hybrid approach.
Yeah, and I think that there's also a need to consider some of the human, the impacts, or how we can encourage planting of mangroves through some modification of our codes, such that property owners on the shoreline there's this fine dance between, if you let a mangroves take root, then you're stuck with it because you can't cut it down. And people are like, no, you're not going to plant, we're not going to do this, because then I will never be able to trim the mangroves and I'll lose my view. That's one of the big, counter arguments to allowing this type of thing in front of a private property owner in particular. And I think maybe there's some way that by getting a better understanding of how these protective benefits are obtained, and how you can work some kind of compromise where some, trimming to some levels is allowed and other things. And I know that some of the municipalities are working on some of these things as well. So there's a lot of complicating factors that come into play as well. We have another question here from Daniel Padilla Ochoa, and it's he directed it to Landolf, which is a similar topic here. Installing seawalls with mangroves, we need space, and a lot of sites near urban areas, there's scarce land for successful mangrove growth. Any comment on how to work there?
Well, again, I think what should resonate there is that you have to work with the site conditions. We do have a pilot mangrove, seawall mangrove installation that we're working on in Wahoo Bay. This is an inlet in Hillsborough. So we're working on having a system there that works not only with, let's say, the small footprint that we're allowed. We also have seagrass in front of our seawall there. So we have to be careful with that. But also the fact that we have a depth. And I think that's another component that Juan mentioned about this. So you have to think about, okay, the mangroves cannot be, they like the variation of the tide, and they need that actually, but on the same time, in our canals, we're typically deeper than what the mangroves would like. So we have to work with that. So we have a kind of an engineer system that we're working on. This is working progress there, and we hope that we will have the installation sometime soon. So this is work in collaboration with a nonprofit up in Broward County, with the city of Pompano Beach and the Shipwreck Foundation there. And with respect to things getting real and getting the permits, I think that, Brian said the communities, and I think the organisms and all the, I would say, officials there, the moment we do our science correctly and we show this, I think we can promote change even on those on that side. So I think everybody's open, and we'll actually welcome, let's say, new data that will show the positive work there that can be done or could be done with those projects. So the key there for us, I think, is to show those measurements, those data points of the real projects that can promote that change. I think that's what Borja was mentioning before, and that's what Juan was alluding also, that we need those data sets, we need those maps, we need that science to be promoted to the level where we have those pilot projects and we show that we can do it the right way. So we're working with them, actually.
That's in response to the question. There's also there about if getting, and the question was another question from Daniel Padilla Ochoa, is in Miami-Dade, we have to contend with the Bay Preserve, and it's incredibly hard to get permits to do anything in the Bay. Have you guys had any experience in working with DERM? Well, I don't want to go too far and say that it's everything's barreling along rapidly, because they have a mission to be protective of these things. And as Landolf mentioned, I think that as more and more things get demonstrated that they can perform the basic function of a seawall, then the agencies that are permitting this stuff are looking for solutions that are less reflective, that can incorporate these nature-based things. I think there's a lot of willingness to look at these types of solutions, as long as you can demonstrate that they perform the same basic function and are not vulnerable for causing any kind of additional ancillary damage. Say they fall apart and get carried along and knock out some other type of thing or something. Anyways, there's a lot of desire from various agencies involved to try to go this direction. So I'm optimistic that the permitting is, although it's still going to be a big challenge, is moving towards a place where we can get these things in the water and start to do them at larger and larger scales as we learn more about them.
Yeah, maybe something that I can add is that, so I would like to clarify that it's not one versus the other. So many times it's like these hybrid solutions, but it's also in the case that Landolf mentioned, like you may have a canal that is just too deep and not suitable for mangrove restoration in front of the levee of the seawall, but there might be like something downstream that is actually reducing the surge potential at that site, right? And that could be like restoring the mangrove, so just influencing other type of hydrodynamics. So it works at the system scale. So everything is related through the coastal processes and how the waves and surge propagate. So it has to be resolved at that scale. So maybe you can have an intervention downstream that has effects upstream in those levee and seawall systems. So, but it's never one versus the other. It's actually a layer of defenses and adaptation options.
Okay. Did we have any other questions that anybody would like to address to the panel at this time?
If I can come off of mute, it might be easier than typing. And thanks for answering my question, guys. Yeah, I'm trying to cook breakfast and lunch for my family in here and trying to tune in, so you guys can imagine the scene. So thank you for answering the last question. I wanted to also ask about water quality. So we talked about mangroves, we talked about coral reefs. We even talked about the connection with upstream from, like the Everglades. We can talk about SERP, we can talk about BBC here, but I'm wondering if the water quality that you guys are observing coming into specifically Miami-Dade County, or we can extrapolate to go with a global scale of what kinds of nutrients we really need in a place in order for a successful uptake of mangroves, in order for a successful maintenance of coral reefs. And I guess now we're really talking about restoration of coral reefs at this point. But in general, water quality, what do we need to see in order to have a successful, resilience component coming out of mangroves and coral reefs?
Anybody want to take that question?
I mean, I could speak to a little bit of it, where specifically with Biscayne Bay, it is historically oligotrophic, right? So there's not a lot of nutrients, or it's supposed to not have a lot of nutrients. We do see a lot of nutrient influx, which, you know, causes harmful algal blooms, and you see that affecting a lot more, say, like seagrasses. But I feel mangroves have been a little bit more undeterred by the nutrient influx or the nutrient changes that we tend to see in these areas. It, you know, so I can't say for sure, you know, is there a specific kind of water quality that we want for restoration? I would say your best water quality is what they've been surviving with, right? But mangroves tend to look for more so, you know, is there low wave action? Is there a long tidal gradient? Are they getting that, you know, they just need that nutrient back and forth. They just need the water going in and they need the water going out. They need to be able to exchange their carbon dioxide out of the water. They need to get the oxygen back in. So it's more of like a physical movement than it is you're looking for like chemicals within the water themselves that are going to promote that growth in the first place.
Yeah. If there's anybody else on the call that has an ability to comment on it, that is, I think our panel is not necessarily the right ones to address the water quality issues. I know I dabble in it, but I'll probably get somebody agitated on my observations, in the sense that the mangroves, as Juan said, the mangroves, you know, they're not maybe as sensitive as the seagrasses and the corals are to these things. Obviously, we have huge problems with seagrass die-offs in the bay, and that is clearly a long-term problem for Biscayne Bay. And then the corals are sensitive to these things, but you know, we have corals growing in some of the heaviliest urbanized places, and I guess we just have to figure out for Miami how we can encourage these corals that are more resilient to fluctuations in nutrient levels and other types of water quality parameters. So hopefully that's part of this. That's a part of these types of projects going forward, is when we do these coral outplantings, or when these are done, is to do them with corals that have some selected or encouraged resilience to temperature fluctuations, or have been proven to be more resilient to poor water quality. So that's part of the answer for corals, and is to select to replant, to outplant corals with strains that are resistant. So no, yeah, go ahead, Rafael.
Brian, I had a comment on this. We're talking again, emphasizing on the corals and emphasizing on the mangroves, but we just mentioned the die-off that we've been having on the seagrass. Doesn't the seagrass contribute to the retainage of the sand levels and so on in the area? And would its die-off is it not detrimental to everything else we've been talking about? And should we be thinking along the lines, as part of that resilience, of eliminate, helping preserve the seagrass?
Can I jump in there? And I think the key there is what Borja said before, like you have to have a system approach. Of course, seagrass is one of the systems that actually helps retain not only the sediments in place, but also the ecosystems around it. And then of course it has an impact on the water quality. And it's also like linked with water quality. So water quality is a key dimension. I know that in our projects, we have people who are experts, and I see some of them here on this call. But I mean, what I want to say there is in our projects, we try not to harm. And when you're working with those restoration projects, you have to work with what basically the ecosystem that you're working on around the site that you have. So again, we mentioned the mangroves here, we mentioned the corals, but seagrass is, I think, the third one that we typically consider on those, let's say, type of projects there. So everything is linked in a way, but you approach it like in a holistic way, but you have to kind of put the boundaries there. So I agree with you. We should definitely take care of our seagrass, and it's definitely effective, and water quality is also a key dimension, but you have to kind of work in the boundaries of your project in a way. So, I mean, it's just that in what we presented here, I don't think we have a seagrass component there, although, I mean, there are definitely efforts there.
Yeah. Yeah, so if I can elaborate on that, I mean, in the modeling we did for the insurance policy in the Mesoamerican Reef, I mean, we included seagrasses there, but the thing with seagrasses is that in terms of wave attenuation, their role is minor compared to these other ecosystems that we are talking about, like coral reefs as natural submerged breakwaters, then the beach and the dune systems as natural flood protection, and then the emergent vegetation. So seagrasses reduce wave energy, but is comparatively much less than others. The important role of seagrasses, though, and I don't think there is much research on this there, is actually contributing to help the beach profile to become more stable against storm action and erosion. So just by maintaining the sediment. So this is something that we should definitely put in value and investigate more in these pilots, right? Moving forward. So that for me, I mean, flooding, we're increasing our knowledge and understanding of flooding and flood risk reduction benefits of nature-based solutions. And I think now we are moving into understanding better and characterizing better the erosion control benefit. And that will involve seagrasses and restoring seagrasses just to maintain beach stability as a resilient infrastructure.
Thank you all. This last chance I'll have before we have a few more minutes here. If anybody has one more question or any other questions. If not, you can unmute yourself right now for the ease if you have a question. I will get on my soapbox briefly and say that I think that the panel here has stressed multiple times the importance of looking at these systems, the whole system as a system, and that I think that's critical for any coastal area in the U.S. and the world. And particularly so here in Miami-Dade, we have so many different stressors on our water systems. And as we go forward and plan in an era of sea level rise, and we have such critical issues to address and, stressing needs to do major things to protect our coastline, we always have to consider what the impacts on our water quality, what the other. And that requires a lot of modeling and a lot of study and a lot of understanding of the system in order to understand what those potential impacts will be. Okay, so now I guess I would just like to thank everybody for all the people for attending this session and sticking with it and your thoughtful questions and participation. I'd like to thank the panel for your talks and Landolf and Juan and Borja. Thank you very much for your participation, and thank you, Jennifer, for pulling this all together. And I hope you all get a chance to enjoy the rest of the symposium, and there'll be other discussions related to this topic in the afternoon as well. There'll be a 3:30 panel discussion related to this also. Thank you all. Let's give a round of applause, virtual applause, to our panelists here and everybody else who participated. Thank you.